It is deja vu all over again, as for the second time in the past 8 months, Vinay Prasad is out at FDA. What happened and what it means for the agency going forward. Plus, how the science has reached a tipping point in halting fibrosis, one of industry's most persistent challenges, and the latest clinical updates on psychedelics and obesity therapies. I'm Stephen Hansen, co-host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues,
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
And Steve Usdin, Washington Editor.
All right, well, before we dive into those topics, a few of our colleagues, Jeff Simone and a few others, are over in Seoul for our 5th annual BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit, which is starting today. And launching at the East-West Summit, we are excited to introduce a new exclusive opportunity for BioCentury subscribers. Step inside the BioCentury Lounge, a dedicated space designed to connect, recharge, and inspire conversation among industry leaders. Experience unique networking moments, insider insights, and a place to unwind between sessions. Don't wait. Check out more at biocenturylounge.com.
Can we get one of those lounges in Washington?
I'm sure we can work something out for you, Steve. I'm sure we can get you a little space to relax there. You don't already have one?
No, well, I like the unique networking and all that kind of stuff. That sounded really fun.
Well, I'm sure we can figure something out. Give Josh a call. I'm sure he can sort you out. But in the meantime, before we get Steve his own personal BioCentury Lounge, we're also looking ahead to this year's BioEquity Conference, which is happening in Prague at the beginning of May. So if you have any companies that are interested in presenting this year, please do reach out to Jeff for more information on that. Right. So, Steve, you're just getting back from what I was hoping was, a nice, relaxing vacation. From what you've told me before we started recording here, doesn't sound like it was as relaxing as you might have hoped it would have been. You can just decide whether you want to disclose that or not. But, you come back to Vinay Prasad out at FDA. First off, is this going to be our last conversation about Prasad at FDA or not?
No, of course not. He's been fired once. No, this is the second time. Is he going to come back for a third round? I doubt it. But is he going to just, slink off into the sunset? No, I doubt that also. He's going to definitely be a character who's going to be in the ecosystem for some time. But anticipating your question, why? And why now? Right. Why was he fired now? I mean,
what happened?
Yeah, what happened? Okay. I think that it can be all summed up in a word, which is hubris. And it's the same thing that led to his ouster the first time. In a way, in a big way, this was personal. It was about his personal behavior, but it's also institutional. And I think that the institutional part gets to what comes next. But first, the personal part. He treated patients, FDA staff, drug companies, the scientific community, and the public with complete contempt and arrogance. His lack of concern for the impact of his decisions on DMD patients led to his first firing. FDA staff who worked for and with him describe his behavior as off the charts. Threats, foul languages, allegations of harassment, and more. His refusal to accept an application for Moderna's flu vaccine and his treatment of Unicure, along with his disdain for advisory committees, reflect his contempt for scientific expertise and the companies that turn science into medicine. The institutional part, it's a mistake to look at specific decisions Prasad made and try to evaluate, were they good or were they bad? There's this old trope about a swinging pendulum at FDA. It really doesn't apply here. What really matters, I think, is not what decisions that he made, but how the decisions were made. For years, I cringed when people said, oh, the FDA commissioner or a center director approved or rejected a specific drug. And I tried to explain that there are large teams of experienced reviewers who make decisions, and that the commissioner never makes approval decisions, and center directors very rarely become involved. McCary and Prasad threw all of that out the window. So whether you agree or disagree with specific decisions, I think everyone loses when one or two individuals are making decisions. They're picking winners and losers. And the fact that those decisions are influenced by politics and by an unscientific ideology, and that's what MAHA is, makes it even worse. And I think this explains the disconnect between Prasad's and McCary's promises to promote rare disease therapies and their actions. But none of this was why Prasad was pushed out. I think it was a culmination of factors. One was his war on vaccines and on mRNA technology in particular. HHS Secretary Kennedy and McCary were totally on board with those views, and they wanted him to pursue anti-vaccine policies. But those policies don't poll well. The White House has been seeing polls about vaccines and about mRNA. Winning the midterms is the top priority for the White House. Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla publicly attacking Prasad's vaccine policies, and my guess is that his and other CEOs' private calls to the White House made Prasad a political liability. The string of reversals and setbacks for rare disease therapies also created political blowback. So I think all of those things kind of combined to push him out.
So, Steve, are you saying that this would have been like the White House's call to make, that this wouldn't have been someone at HHS or McCary who would have made this call?
Well, it certainly wasn't McCary. McCary and Prasad were joined at the hip. McCary never passed up an opportunity to call Prasad a genius. He used that word repeatedly, over and over. He lavished praise on him. Even very recently, he did that. So I think that there's no way that this was McCary's call. It's possible that it was Kennedy's, but I think that especially in an election season, a decision like this had to have come from the White House. I know that there was a lot of pressure. There are people who were calling the White House, CEOs and other people who were influential, calling for Prasad's ouster. The Wall Street Journal's campaign against him was no secret. Neither was the editorials that I wrote calling for the industry to demand his ouster.
And Albert Bourla did as well in public very recently, the same week, just I think a few days before he was kicked out.
Exactly. So I think it's a mistake, though, to focus entirely on Prasad. And if you're trying, and the key thing now is to think about, well, what happens next, right?
Right.
The thing that I think was really disturbing about Prasad, besides his personal behavior, is the view that one or two people can and should make decisions about approvals, about public health, and about the fate of people with serious diseases. And that reflects McCary's views also. That's what the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program is about. McCary is also completely on board with the idea that external scientific advice, that the views of patients are obstacles rather than essential aspects of the regulation of medical products. He's made that clear. And he's engaged in one of the things that Prasad did, speaking about pending drug applications, which some lawyers and lawmakers say is illegal. And McCary has promoted the idea that Tylenol causes autism and leucovorin can treat autism, messages that aren't backed up by scientific evidence. And he's committed to the idea that it makes sense to cherry pick some applications based on factors that include pricing and adherence to President Trump's MFN policies for preferential treatment. Here's another thing that McCary did. When he was asked on CNBC about Prasad's politics, he said that Prasad had supported Bernie Sanders in the past, but now he's a staunch supporter of Trump. I think that the only thing that's more inappropriate than a journalist asking an FDA commissioner about the personal politics of an agency employee is a commissioner answering the question. This is not something that should be done. Disease doesn't know any politics. Patients don't care about the politics of FDA employees, and they shouldn't. So we know that HHS Secretary Kennedy is going to be involved in picking or approving Prasad's successor, and likely the White House. And that leads to real questions about who it's going to be, but also what kind of person it is. What are the criteria going to be? So, here's what I'm looking for. Is the person going to be selected based on experience, temperament, and qualifications? Or is loyalty to Trump and Kennedy and the Maha ideology the criteria? We already saw what happened when George Tidmarsh was forced out at CBER. If you made a list of 1,000 people who are qualified to lead CBER, Tracy Beth Hoag wouldn't be on it. She's there because she espoused views on COVID that are in sync with Kennedy and McCary, and both of them view her as loyal. But she's not qualified to run CBER. Another question, is the appointment intended to be lasting? Because now McCary, he's spending Prasad's time at FDA as a sabbatical, that he took a sabbatical from his academic position to come into government. That's not the way that it was described when he came in initially, and it's not the way that center directors have traditionally been viewed, and it's not a way to create a stable environment at the center. Does the new CBER director come in with an agenda? And if he does or she does, is it Maha? Does it include reviving morale at the center, which is incredibly low? Does it include trying to bring some of the people Prasad pushed out back into FDA? And will the Will they create a climate where people who were pushed out or felt that they had to leave will be comfortable coming back? Remember that one of the big factors in Rick Pazder's decision to resign as CBER director was McCary's tolerance for Prasad's actions and demands.
So, Steve, I mean, what I think in some ways what you're getting at, what it kind of comes down to is, is this going to fundamentally change anything in terms of the way that CBER operates or approaches things relative to how Prasad was operating it? Because I mean, just one small data point here, but obviously, you mentioned Unicure earlier, who was at the center of kind of the most recent sort of drama around FDA, and their stock, investors are reacting as if Prasad was maybe not the only, but one of the primary sort of barriers to their Huntington's disease gene therapy. Is that kind of the right way to think about it, or is the expectation that someone's going to come in who's going to continue to espouse similar viewpoints?
I'm going to add on to that question. What about McCary's role here? I mean, he does look at individual things, right? Where does he fit into this?
It's difficult to predict exactly, but I think some things are pretty sure to happen. I think that whoever comes in, they're going to have a mandate to not generate news, right? I've written before that the last thing that any president really wants to see is the FDA commissioner on the news, or the FDA in general on the news, because it's never good news for the administration when that happens, or very rarely. I think that whoever comes in, at least between now and the midterms, is going to be under instructions to keep a lid on vaccine controversies, to avoid controversies involving rare disease drug approvals. Whether that extends to the reversing some of the decisions that Prasad made that really upset important constituencies is uncertain, right? I think that certainly it can't be bad news for Unicure, for Huntington's disease patients. By the way, I think it's a mistake to focus on Unicure. I think that the people to focus on is the Huntington's disease community, and the fact that they have had what seems like the first disease-modifying therapy, or potentially disease-modifying therapy, if not snatched away from them, certainly delayed. And then they've been subjected to this notion from FDA that patients should undergo sham therapy and be willing to receive a placebo, and then wait for outcomes for a uniformly terrible disease that takes some time to progress. That's really horrible. So because they're making decisions that are based on politics rather than public health decisions, I think that Prasad's replacement and McCary face some really tough choices. And as a result of that, my guess is that the next person in the job may not last very long, even if it is somebody who they have the intention to keep there for some time. Like I said, the administration wants to keep vaccines out of the news ahead of the midterm elections, but FDA is going to have to make a decision about Moderna's flu vaccine this summer. Rejecting the vaccine would cause a furor, so would approving it. The Maha base is furious about the Trump administration's support for the Roundup herbicide. They'll be even more energized and upset by a vaccine approval. And it isn't really possible just to kick the can down the road either, because if an approval decision isn't made at some point during the summer, it will become too late to get a vaccine manufactured and deployed in time for the upcoming flu season. So that's going to be a really tough decision that FDA is going to have to make. Whatever decision they make, they're going to upset somebody. I think that there are a number of other decisions that are going to be coming up that are similar, where there are constituencies on both sides of it. And this is exactly the reason why in the past it's been, really dogma at FDA that you avoid even the appearance of political interference in decision making, because decisions often upset somebody, some constituency. And if you're bowing to one constituency or another, and it's even so extreme that it results in firing of staff and things like that, you get really into an untenable situation very quickly.
Any early leaders in the clubhouse, Steve, in terms of who might be taking over at CBER yet?
I'm hearing rumors, but they're rumors, and I don't think it does anybody any good for me to repeat them right now.
Fair enough. Well, maybe that'll be a topic for another another pod to come here as we get a bit more information. But thanks, Steve.
Probably next week. And by the way, you asked about, is this the last we're going to be hearing about Prasad? It's also important to note he's not gone, right? He's supposed to stay until for another month or so. So we may be hearing some other things from him and from FDA in that time period.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Steve. That's super interesting insights there. As you said, probably is not going to be the last bit of drama coming out of FDA that we're going to hear about.
Oh,
but,
no.
Appreciate it. I'd like to now move on to Lauren. So, Lauren, you published last week the first of what I think is going to be sort of a series of stories on fibrosis, right? With IPF in particular. What did you find in terms of sort of industry progress towards new antifibrotic mechanisms?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I focused on IPF because this was an indication where we haven't seen, until December, there has not been a new drug approval for about a decade. So in December, Boehringer got an approval for nerandomilast, and this adds to two drugs that were approved over 10 years ago for this indication. But all three of these therapies are known to effectively slow progression of this idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF. There's still a ton of opportunity to stop progression or potentially even reverse fibrosis in this indication and in many, many other diseases with fibrotic pathology. I thought this was just an interesting place to see what other progress is happening, because when we look to liver fibrosis and all of the progress in MASH, there is evidence now that you can actually reverse some of the fibrosis. It's not entirely clear if that's because of the organ that you're targeting in that place. The liver has a big regenerative capacity, but I think it's kind of re-energized the field, the idea that you might actually be able to do this. And when you're looking at IPF, the unmet need is so great. People talk about the survival times being comparable to really advanced and aggressive cancers, even with the therapies that we have on the market. One thing that I noticed that I think everyone who's familiar with the field probably knows is that there's not a lot right behind this recent Boehringer approval. BMS has a therapy that's in phase 3 that should read out this year. And then there are not too many others at the late stages of development. But the phase 2 pipeline is very, very active. So there are more than 20 programs in phase 2. Most of them go against different targets. Most of those targets have first-in-class potential. And so what we don't know right now is whether these new targets, new mechanisms that people are applying to IPF will have, a safety or efficacy advantage over everything else. But we will get a wave of proof of concept data.
Lauren, sorry.
So, Lauren, I just wanted to know about those programs that are in the phase 2 testing. Do we have any sense as to how many of those fit into this prior bucket of mechanisms that you might expect to slow progress but not halt it, versus what might actually be getting at that, being able to fully stop fibrosis progression or even reverse it? Do we have any sense of how those split out?
So I don't know that we have actual numbers on that. And I think every company that you speak to is probably going to say that they think that their therapy can halt fibrosis. Sure. So one of the problems with the 3 approved therapies, I think, from what I've heard, is a therapeutic index issue. So what happens with pulmonary fibrosis specifically is there's an injury to the lung, which can happen over time. It can be persistent or maybe an acute thing, that triggers an inflammatory and a pro-fibrotic cascade that eventually activates and expands fibroblasts and ends up creating this extracellular matrix that, the fibrosis that damages cells and makes the organs not work. So a lot of the strategies that have been tested, and there have been a lot of phase 3 failures in this indication, kind of hit the top of that cascade or, try to dampen this entire process. But the problem is this is needed for normal wound healing. It's needed for a lot of normal cellular processes. So toxicity has been a big issue. So there's that therapeutic index issue where maybe if you could get the right target, get the right dose, it might not be the mechanism itself is not correct for, stopping this process. So a lot of these companies are going downstream or targeting just a piece, one of the arms of these really complex pathways, or trying to sort of dampen the amplification signals, for example. again, there's been a lot of phase 2 success that hasn't translated to phase 3. I think there are just a lot of open questions about what will work. And some of the trials aren't that long either. So something that shows sort of an initial burst in lung function over the first 4 months or 3 months may not actually end up being a long-term solution. So a lot of translational problems in this indication.
So Lauren, what you were saying earlier was super interesting. Like if you hit that cascade at the very top and you shut down the entire fibrotic mechanism, you can probably guess that you'll have some efficacy, but then you have this therapeutic window issue. And then if you hit one of the arms of the complex pathway downstream, I guess, which is what you're saying people are doing now, is this a case where we're going to learn about which specific pathways are sort of redundant and can be replaced by another easily, and which are kind of fundamental to the disease process through clinical trial work?
I think that's the hope. There's a lot of talk about how redundant these pathways are. There's a lot of cross-talk interplay between the pathways too. So one target isn't necessarily just in one arm of these pro-fibrotic signaling pathways or pro-inflammatory signaling pathways. The way I'm looking at it, and I don't know if this is how everyone's looking at it, but I think as these phase 2 results, proof of concept results come out, we should sort of maybe get a better understanding of which parts of this pathway are more fundamental to the pathology in IPF in particular, and maybe other fibrotic diseases as well. There's quite a bit of talk about how, this has been sort of an entry point for some companies into fibrotic diseases because there is a lot of overlap in how these pathways work across the different organs. It's not perfect overlap. There are different targets are more active in different disease settings, but it's a very active area of science where the learnings can definitely translate.
For the biology geeks out there, Lauren did diagram some of this biology in her story and point out 6 different sort of intervention points that companies are looking at. So if you and map the targets to those intervention points. So if you're interested, check out her story.
Yeah. Lauren, any chance you can give us a little preview or taster of the next fibrosis story that you're going to be coming out with?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So I spoke with the head of Boehringer's discovery team for inflammatory and respiratory diseases to get a sense of how a leader in the IPF and fibrosis drug development field is thinking about the next wave of technologies. So we'll have a Q&A story come out based on that conversation, which was really interesting. And that is kind of looking beyond the fibroblasts and myofibroblast cell types that we hear so much about. And they're really focusing on the alveolar cells and regenerating, the cells that are injured in this process. And I'm also looking at the new discovery methods and new modalities that are being applied to fibrosis, not IPF specifically, just more broadly. So the idea that if we move beyond the small molecules that have been such a focus here and use different modalities or different ways of thinking about treating this, maybe actually, getting rid of the fibrosis, degrading that, or completely different ways of thinking about treating this type of pathology might be possible. So this is the very early stage research in the field.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thanks, Lauren. That sounds like super interesting stuff. As Selena noted, you can check out Lauren's story on fibrosis at BioCentury.com. Yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the stuff that's coming out too. Appreciate it. So Selena, now going to come to you because I think as most people, if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you've probably know that Selena is a pretty big fan of psychedelics on the podcast. So why don't you kind of fill us in on the latest clinical update from last week?
Thanks, Stephen. Well, maybe I'll actually take a step back and say when we were doing our big catalyst package in January, looking for what are the clinical readouts, the big milestones coming this year, we noticed that 26 is going to be catalyst rich for the psychedelic space. So just very briefly, I want to say the headline news there, right, came last month with Compass Pathways announcing it had met its endpoint in a phase 3 trial for treatment-resistant depression for a psilocybin analog. So that was its second positive phase 3. So by the end of this year, they hope to submit an NDA, and this may be the next regulatory test for a psychedelic at FDA. They were able to raise some money on that. After the Lykos sort of debacle in PTSD, depression is the lead indication for psychedelics. And there are 2 other companies that expect phase 3 data this year. The other 2, Cybin, which is now known as Hellas, and MindMed, which is now known as Definium, a lot of rebranding after the Lykos thing. But both, one has a psilocybin analog, one has an LSD analog. Those are coming in the second half. Okay. But then since then, we've also had a couple of earlier stage readouts. So the one last week was from Cybin Hellas, not for its lead in depression, but for a different program in phase 2 for generalized anxiety disorder. So this is another indication with sort of a cluster of activity from different kinds of psychedelics. And so this is for a DMT type compound, which, like LSD and psilocybin, is highly psychoactive and hallucinogenic, but it's shorter acting is kind of its advantage. And what was interesting about this one is the company reported that it met its endpoint in these patients who are highly refractory to treatment, long time, like at least 10 years post-diagnosis, not well controlled on their standard of care therapies, right? So tough indication. They met the endpoint at the primary analysis, and then I think there was 67% were in remission at 6 months. So there's some durability there, and yet the company's shares fell 34% that day, right? So the question is, why? And I can never be 100% sure why, but when I was looking into the way this trial was designed, it's kind of an interesting one. So psychedelic studies are notoriously hard to control because these compounds are so powerfully psychoactive. You pretty much know if you're in the treatment group or the placebo group, right? And so one design that companies are taking and that FDA has suggested is to use an active comparator. And so in some cases, what that means is you want to use a lower dose of your therapeutic compound that it just meets the threshold for being perceptible, but is not projected to be therapeutic. So if you can separate a little bit some of those side effects from the efficacy, then that's what they're trying to do. And that is how this company messaged this trial design all along until they had the phase 2 data. And then they ended up just pooling the 2 dose groups because they performed identically. When you have functional unblinding and people can guess which dose group you're in, and you have something like a psychedelic where there's a lot of high expectations, people, there's a lot of mainstream media covers that suggest these are like massive breakthroughs, right? It can inflate your efficacy. And so there's kind of like 3 possibilities now, right? Like, yeah, functional unblinding and expectation bias are really driving the efficacy here, or the low dose is actually effective, or something else. Small studies are noisy and you just, can't always like get a good read. But right. It just means that paradigm, it has a mark against it now because we didn't come out with like really clear dose response and there was no placebo arm. So you can compare against that either.
This is kind of, as you mentioned, this is kind of a chronic problem, and this is something that they'll always have to deal with, right? I mean, is how you try and blind these studies without having that immediate functional unblinding.
Yeah, you blind them by everybody knowing, quote unquote, that they're in the treatment arm, right?
Right. Well, really interesting, Selena. Appreciate the. I'm sure you'll stay on top of this. I have no doubt.
I will.
But you mentioned the catalysts, and I sort of had a similar, I guess, scenario in that we published the 2026 Obesity Catalyst story about a month ago, and we've also already had a couple milestones kind of drop that we'd been sort of projecting were coming, and so I just kind of wanted to quickly highlight 2 of those. So the first one was from Novo. This was the Redefine 4 study that was a head-to-head of their CagriSema, amylin, GLP-1 versus Lilly's Zepbound tirzepatide. So this was the study that Novo was really hoping would separate them from Lilly and sort of give them the opportunity to be able to launch pretty strongly if they showed, some meaningful, at least as good as, if not better than Lilly's drug. And then, hopefully you're a bit better on safety. Unfortunately, probably could not have gone worse for Novo, I think. They essentially paid millions of dollars to conduct a study that I would guess Lilly would probably want to put on their own label. So the 84-week study showed that CagriSema patients lost 23% of their weight versus 25.5% for the high-dose Zepbound. Essentially, it ran into the same problems that Novo saw with their Redefine 1 study, the first phase 3 for CagriSema, in which protocol allowed for dose modification. So that meant some patients didn't reach or sustain their highest CagriSema dose. The study was open label. That just relates to the fact that CagriSema requires this sort of dual chamber device. It can't be intermixed. And so you kind of already knew you couldn't blind it because of the device that was going to be used. We had this situation where, patients were basically knowing if they were getting the investigational drug or if they were getting a drug that they've probably heard all about on TV commercials and radio ads, especially if you live in the US with Zepbound. So, it's hard to say how much that really confounded sort of the outcome there, but it was kind of a big disaster for Novo. I mean, this basically investors wiped out 26 billion market cap in late February. And it really now, CagriSema was Novo's opportunity to kind of try and regain some of the obesity market that they had been sort of losing to Lilly. And I think this is going to be a pretty big setback in terms of their timeline as to when they have their next opportunity to kind of regain that market share, because it just seems hard to see how CagriSema is going to be able to launch later this year and really dent, Lilly's tirzepatide franchise, which is kind of on a rocket ship up as things stand. Just really quickly, the next big opportunity Novo's probably going to have is with zenagamtide. It's formerly known as amycretin, but that's just started phase 3 testing. So while they haven't given any guidance on data or regulatory submissions yet, I think the best guess that readouts are in late 2027, maybe early 2028. And so you're probably not, looking at a launch till 2029. And in the meantime, oral therapies are going to get more established. You're probably going to have injectables on the market that have once monthly, maybe more infrequent dosing. So it's going to be a different market by the time that program reaches there. So not a great position for Novo to be in right now. The other one I just wanted to highlight was from last week. Zealand Pharma and Roche announced phase 2 data for their amylin program, petrelintide, as a monotherapy. Now, the markets hated this one as well. Zealand was down 37% on the news. And part of that, I think, some of that comes down to, just in my personal opinion, I think some of that comes down to messaging, kind of the same trap that Novo fell into with CagriSema, in that, I think Zealand had kind of been suggesting that they could get maybe mid upper teens in terms of weight loss for this therapy. What they did show was placebo-adjusted weight loss of 9% at 42 weeks. So that's not far off from what we saw with like a GLP-1 with Wegovy, but it's about half of what Lilly showed with eloralintide at 48 weeks. So in terms of efficacy, still a lot to be desired there for the Zealand program. I think it definitely fell short of expectations on that side. But I don't think the data is nearly as bad as maybe the investors are making out, primarily because of the safety data that they reported. So, on a placebo-adjusted basis, you have to remember all of these incretin therapies, all the obesity therapies that we've seen so far, GI tolerability has always been the main primary issue. And just keeping patients on drug has been the main issue, especially in a real world setting. So on a placebo-adjusted basis, they basically showed no vomiting, no diarrhea, no constipation across the entire trial for the petrelintide treated patients. Nausea was about 13%, whereas the pooled data for eloralintide showed about 20% on nausea. And treatment discontinuation rates for adverse events were actually lower for treated patients than they were for placebo. So it was a pretty stellar data set with regard to tolerability. I guess the reason why I'm more optimistic about that, despite the efficacy that was shown there, was because I think when you think about the obesity population, I think there's a large group of people that would be more than happy to lose 10 to 15% of their weight. And if you can offer them something that doesn't have the GI side effects, so you're going to be able to keep patients on therapy much longer than what we typically observe with GLP-1 therapies. As I mentioned, I think that real world experience is about 80% of patients discontinue within 1 year. And the problem with that is then you have this cycling effect where people can then regain that weight. And typically you're regaining more fat than you are muscle. And so it can be this really bad cycle that you can go into. I think anything that offers the opportunity to lose the weight that patients want, and if you have a tolerability profile that will keep them on therapy and prevent that rebound, I think that's a pretty compelling commercial proposition. Again, quite early phase 2 data, but I think it'll be interesting to see how they adjust as they move into phase 3.
I know it's too early, really, to think about commercial dynamics, but I do wonder if the sweet spot for it would be the like second line. Just thinking of like the psychology of the patient or whatever, if they just initially think, oh, I just want to go for the one where I'm going to lose weight fast, but then they hit those GI issues that make so many people go off drug. They're like, is there anything else? Like, can I try with anything else?
That's an interesting one. Yeah, for the group of patients who don't make it through the first month or something like that and don't actually get much weight loss because they just can't tolerate it. If they're like, oh, is there something else I could try? And they're like, yeah, well, there's one that doesn't have any of those problems. You just might not lose as much. That might be a pretty compelling opportunity. And I should mention just very quickly, just because it just came up today, also in connection with amylin, AbbVie announced today their first phase 1 data for ABV-295, which is their amylin that they licensed from Gubra last year. That showed about 9.5%, so a little bit more than what Zealand showed in placebo-adjusted weight loss, but that was after just 12 weeks. That looks to be much more in line with maybe what we saw from Lilly. But what we didn't see and what they didn't give any detail on was the AE profile. So I think that'll be sort of one of the very interesting dynamics, I think, in amylin is sort of how much you push for efficacy versus how much you optimize for that tolerability profile that differentiates it from another incretin therapy. Yeah, still plenty more to come, I'm sure, from amylin and other mechanisms in obesity. I think that's all we have time for today. So please do check out our latest episode of our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, where I had a delightful chat with SoftBank's Jackie Falk about the future of AI in biopharma, the opportunity for life sciences in the UK, and the importance of broadening representation across our industry. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.